thank you so much for having me with you here tonight. My name is James Ellsmoor, and I grew up in a place that looked like this. A small village in the north of England that a lot of people would consider as really the back and beyond, or the middle of nowhere, I've heard it called. But to me, growing up, it felt like the center of the world. To get to my house, you'd leave the city, you'd drive down small rural lanes, the houses would gradually get sparser, and eventually you get somewhere that looked like this. You get to somewhere that looked like this, where out of the window you could see a couple of other houses in the distance and a whole lot of sheep. So for me, as I said, that felt like the center of the world, and growing up, a lot of my friends would ask me questions like, what do you do for fun? What happens there? How do you even live there? Or even they'd be suspicious that I might be scared living so far away from other people. But that was the normal for me, and actually my family had lived in the same house for over 100 years, so we didn't move very far. And then I moved to North Carolina. And well, in America, you all have a slightly different conception of distance, because for me, what felt remote, or what English people would consider remote, was actually a 1-hour drive from the center of Manchester, which is one of the UK's biggest cities. I feel like in Georgia, 2-hour drive to go to your favorite restaurant or to a mall is almost nothing here, you know? The whole of England can easily fit in Georgia. And so we have a slightly different conception of an understanding of what it means to be remote or isolated. Obviously, this is Chapel Hill, where I went to school. But that gave me the understanding that actually the idea of distance or remoteness or isolation is really just a social construct. It depends on where you live, your own experiences, and it's something that we really impose on ourselves. But after living in the US for 5 years, I had the opportunity to study in a place called Orkney. Now, Orkney is a Scottish island, which really changed my idea of what it meant to be remote. To get to Orkney, you drive north, you go through the highlands, through the mountains, you keep going until you reach the northernmost tip of Scotland, and then you get on a boat and you keep going further for another hour or two to reach these islands. It's an archipelago of around 20 islands with around 20,000 people spread across them, or 20 inhabited islands almost, I should say. But I was really fortunate to have the opportunity to study from there, and to me, Orkney, although it's part of my country, part of the United Kingdom, it felt like a different world. Like I'm sure you might feel if you're from Atlanta and you're going to San Francisco or to Alaska. It's the same country, but it's a very, very different experience. But although people from England or the South might feel like Orkney is on the edge of the country, on the edge of the world, if you're from there, it's really the center of the world. And you can actually see on this map that for Orcadians, as the islanders are called, the islands are perfectly situated between Scandinavia, Iceland, Scotland, and historically they were a key trading port. They were conveniently situated when the world depended on ships to have people coming through. But now, as transportation, as ways of thinking change, they are seen to be more on the periphery. But if I ask my friends from Orkney what it's like to live there, they still consider it the center of the world. And so the British poet Philip Larkin was once asked why he chose to live in Hull, which is a small city in the north of England. And the journalist asked him, why did you choose to live so far away from the center? And his response was, the center of what? Because this idea of what is central is really just a political construct. Obviously, it's where the people are, where the money is, but what does that really mean, and who gets to choose what is the center? Another writer called Malachi Talak from the Shetland Islands, which you'll see just to the north, and that's really the northernmost point of the United Kingdom. He wrote about, sorry, give me a second. So another writer from the north of Scotland called Malachi Talak, he wrote about how islands and remote communities conjure up this idea of suspicion for people who don't live there. You have two views that are projected. Either you have a paradise which is the green, remote, idyllic island like you often see the Caribbean or Iceland advertised as. Or you have the Lord of the Flies, the dangerous, murderous place where you can't escape and people are out to get you. And so he argues that people from the outside who don't really know much about a place project these views onto it, and that's what often happens in communities like his. This kind of division between two different worlds. But we live in a world of islands. So I mentioned that I studied in Orkney, but actually had the pleasure to do so while I was living in the Caribbean. So I did my whole degree online, and what was fascinating was that through the technology developed at this university in Scotland, I was able to do this whole degree and still feel part of a community living in this really remote place, or as other people might say it, remote. What was fascinating to me is that while living in the Caribbean, the issues that people were talking about were very, very similar to the issues being talked about by my friends in Scotland. One example, and I come from the renewable energy sector, one example is the cost of electricity. So Jamaicans pay 4 times more on average than Americans pay for electricity. That due to many things, but partly the cost of importing there. In Scotland or in the UK, the parts of the country with the highest levels of energy poverty, so people who pay a large proportion of their income just to keep warm and heat their home, are in places like Orkney in the north of Scotland. Many people pay 20, 30, 40% of their income just on heating their homes. So different places, different climates, different accents, different cultures, but many of these issues are the same, that come from living in places like these that may be considered by many to be remote or isolated communities. And so after seeing these links, I really wanted to work out how we could connect these places. There's an opportunity there to see these very, very different places that have a lot in common to share and to learn from each other. And while I was studying, the University of the Highlands and Islands, where I did my degree, had developed this fantastic technology to bring education to parts of Scotland that hadn't had access to it before. Traditionally, people had had to leave their home communities, go to the big cities to study, and then maybe they'd come back afterwards, but it was a big drain on the population. So this new university actually has the most cutting-edge distance learning technology, which was what allowed me to study from a distance. We were also able to have speakers coming in from places diverse as Canada, as Greenland, the South Pacific, to tell us about their own experiences. And so this gave me the idea that actually by building what I like to call digital bridges between islands or remote communities, we can help them share this knowledge and kind of bypass the center which has traditionally told them what to do. So a radical way of rethinking how we do communication. And so recently I launched the Virtual Island Summit, which was an online conference where we connected 4,000 islanders from around the world to share their own experiences of what that meant for them, discussing issues ranging from energy to waste management to journalism to gender, all about really to share that experience. And what it meant was we could have in a room people from Fiji, Jamaica, Greenland, Mauritius, and the Orkney Islands sharing their own experiences. And it was a way to, again, to bypass the center. And I think this is the power of the internet now. We often think about the negatives of Facebook, of online trolls, of the way that information is sharing. But there are so many positives and so many opportunities that come from this change. And one of those that we've seen now, many people are choosing to work remotely from their own company or work from home. Teams are spread out over the world. But we haven't necessarily thought as much about how this impacts places that were often considered as peripheral or on the edge, and how that really changes what it means to be in these communities. So these, you can see, are some of the different speakers joining in from around the world talking about all of these various different issues. And what this now means is that islands and other remote areas have an opportunity to be innovation leaders. So traditionally, innovation was confined to cities, San Francisco, New York, Atlanta, London, Shanghai, Singapore. That was where the action happened. That was because people, to be innovative, had to live next to each other, had to be able to share ideas easily and congregate. But the internet has changed all that. You can be the CEO of a company and live in the far north of Canada live in Appalachia, live in Hawaii, and you can still be successful and connect with this global community. And the change of pace is happening rapidly. So it's really, for those of you that are entrepreneurs or in any kind of business, you need to be ahead and think, how can you use this change to your advantage? It goes far beyond the applications just for these remote communities that I'm talking about. So this is an example, again, from the Orkney Islands. This is a small island of a few hundred people called Ide that has some of the most cutting-edge technology in the world for hydrogen energy. The Orkney Islands are home to the European Marine Energy Centre, as well as several other research institutions. They have the most advanced efforts for marine energy, tidal energy, and hydrogen storage. And actually, the islands themselves generate 120% of their electricity demand from renewables. So they're ahead of the game. They're innovating way quicker than those of us on the mainland of the UK are doing. And so because they're actually generating more energy that they can use on some days, they're thinking, how can we store this? How can we move forward? And they're creating hydrogen-powered ferries to give transport between the islands. And this is just one example of innovation that can now happen in other places. We also think about when you think about the internet, traditionally you'd think that a remote or a rural place would probably have bad internet. And that was definitely true until recently. But actually now, if you look at the places with the fastest internet in the world, many of those are islands. So Singapore is one, okay, it's a big city, but it's still an island. But in Europe, it's places like the Faroe Islands, in Jersey, and the Channel Islands, that have some of the fastest connections. There's also a place called Ellsmoor in the Republic of Ireland, a small island of 500 people, which has the fastest internet in the Republic. So some of these remote places, and obviously there are still many places that have very slow internet, but they've been able to use the technology to have some of the fastest connections, and that enables them to be almost as competitive in many ways as their colleagues in London and New York. The one thing to think about as well for islands is that traditionally there has been a lot of constraints on people living there. You have had to be innovative because you don't have everything available. You can't just go to Walmart when you run out of something in a lot of cases. So you've got to make use of what you have available and what you have in front of you. And you've had to be innovative and think about that in advance. And so these constraints can also be turned on their head. That very expensive electricity can be an opportunity because it forces you to think ahead and think about how you solve that problem more quickly than your colleagues on a mainland area. So when you think of islands, you might have this idea of a tropical paradise, a tropical idyll that you go on vacation and don't think about much more. But hopefully I've inspired you to think about how remote places have an opportunity to contribute to the global innovation system. Another example of this technology, which I think is really important, or how it can be implemented, is the growing participation we can have. So think about all the potential Einsteins living in Ethiopia or Nigeria or Bangladesh that didn't have access to the internet, maybe lived in a small rural village, living in poverty, and they couldn't really contribute until recently because they had no access to this global system. Well, now more and more people every year have access to the internet, which gives them access to almost limitless information, but also means that they can put their own information out there and they can participate. And so I think that's a huge opportunity with people in countries that didn't necessarily have those opportunities before can become involved, and that benefits us all in the long term. Distance and place and space have defined humans for as long as we can think of. Going right back to the invention of the wheel, to the growth of the automobile, cheap flights, and now the internet, each of those have changed how society works and how we relate to each other. And what I think is really exciting now is this next revolution is the democratization of distance, is bringing people together and allowing people to contribute and be involved regardless of where they live. And who knows in the next 10 years where that's going to take us. So thank you for listening.